welcome more. So for anyone watching, Or and I were just talking about a challenge that he was facing. And as we got talking, the idea of recording this and sharing with you came up because we think there's some valuable insight that can be shared. We started talking about what jiu-jitsu can teach us about Web3. And so, Or, why don't you tell us about the conversation you were having that led to this thread?
Yeah. So really kind of, I had like a challenging week. It was kind of where this all started from, because I basically I've been working with, it's kind of like my policy to work with people who just know way more than me and kind of ask them questions and figure it out with them. So I've been working with a person who's a professor of economics and finance. And he is a traditional finance person. So he is crypto agnostic. He doesn't actually, he's not like anti-crypto, but he's also not, completely all in. He kind of speculates, looks at it from the side. And so I always thought that that's like a great person to advise with. And so this week, after a couple of weeks of kind of working on things together, kind of mentioned that he was kind of getting frustrated because we were talking past each other. So we kind of started to dig in from whatever the idea is as like this big idea, and started drilling down to what do tokenomics look like? How does the token economy of this thing work? And so it sparks kind of a bunch of different conversations, right? Because the first thing that you kind of realize is that the notion of value, kind of like what do we mean when we say value, kind of, I don't know if it differs, but we kept on coming back to this point in the conversation where he's saying to me, well, but where does the value come from, right? Well, why do people want to do this? And, you kind of could describe that there's both a service and that people want to partake in the service. And so there's more value to the token accruing and so on and so forth. But it kept on coming back to this point where I understood that he was not understanding me. I didn't think that I was doing a particularly bad job at explaining what I was thinking. And then, this kind of conversation of which is partial self-doubt kind of starts to arise, where you're asking yourself, well, is it that he doesn't understand because he's not part of this conversation in blockchain and how this technology works? Or am I so far removed from traditional economics and how things work that, I can't even explain myself? And so this kind of conversation of am I explaining myself, or am I just disconnected? Makes you start to think like, well, what's actually happening here? And now I'm thinking like, well, I first of all, I need a second opinion to kind of help triangulate like where I am. Do I know what I'm talking about, or am I just like really down the rabbit hole and I'm only talking to people who understand crypto and understand what I'm talking about? Because the reason that I'm trying to work with somebody who's from the traditional world is because at the end of the day, these are the people that we're going to have to convince, onboard, participate in this new economy that we're building, right? So if he doesn't get it in our one-on-one conversation, then it's going to be super hard to kind of bring others in. And that's why, by the way, like we're still working together, and it's a frustration, and it's like a challenge, but it's not like a deal breaker. So we're still working on it, and yeah. So it's kind of put me in a place of pondering, kind of what are we doing? Like, are we doing this right? And how do we make sure that we're communicating in a meaningful way? And just one more thing that it constantly went back for me in the conversation to kind of like talking about value. Like, what is value? What do we value? How do we value things? And I don't want to like ask a professor of finance like, oh, well, where does value come from? Like, well, does the stock value have any, does the stock market have any value? Does anything have that? Like, how do we know that these things are real? The dollar, only has value because people believe in it. So does Bitcoin. So why can't like this new token economy be just the same? And these questions kind of can feel belittling, and I don't want to like go down that route with him. So yeah, so it's that's kind of the place where all this meets me, and I think it's part of the journey. I assume that it's part of the journey for a lot of people. kind of asking ourselves these questions of, are we conveying the conversation in a good way? And how do we have the conversation at all in the right way with people, so that it makes sense to everybody and we kind of all are on the same page?
First, I want to call out or celebrate or just acknowledge your humility in this, asking like, am I missing something, or just approaching this from a humble place. But I do think that this is generally a challenge that the Web3 space and community have and are going to have. If a professor of economics, who you esteem highly, is having trouble getting this, then how is the average person who doesn't have that grounding going to? And as we were talking, I said that it reminded me of when Jiu-Jitsu came on the scene, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It would be, it's like someone who could be, a 30-year master expert black belt in karate or kung fu or some other art, who then gets introduced to jiu-jitsu and is automatic. It's not the same language. It doesn't make sense. That stuff would never work. Whereas, what we saw when the UFC emerged, or challenge matches, through the family that created it, the Gracie family, were formed. Blue belts in jiu-jitsu were demolishing black belts in other arts. And it's because there's a very different framework, and we're not trying to, defeat this person. We're trying to work with them. We're trying to get them to understand. And really, so we started having this discussion that it's a question of onboarding. And how do you onboard someone to Web3? How do you onboard someone to Jiu-Jitsu? And are there things we can learn in that process? And if you go up to a black belt in another art and you say your stuff is nonsense, it doesn't work, you're going to get their back up. They're not going to listen to you. It's quite the opposite. You have to, appreciate the value of what they have, but say and really start with the pure fundamentals of why there's something new worth looking at. To go to an economics professor who has their own paradigm, my late uncle was taught at University of California, and likewise, was a professor of economics, and didn't necessarily have the ability to, or the grounding to make sense of the Web3 blockchain crypto world. And so as you and I were talking, we kind of unpacked a few of these pieces of how you would onboard someone. And to that value discussion, one of the things we were discussing is, well, with Bretton Woods, like, where does value come from? Value used to be tagged to the gold standard. And now that it's no longer tagged to the gold standard, it's really just a popularity contest. Everything's speculative. And that is, if that can happen for, say, the world economy, can we not, in an effort to explain it in kind of those terms to an economics professor, can we not then just create a microeconomy that works on the same thing? Bitcoin is only has value because other folks feel it has value, as we're seeing now. As that feeling diminishes, so does the value. But that, tell me what you think of that as a way to kind of get over that hump of understanding the value piece, so that people can better understand, or so that, say, someone like this professor can get past that piece of the conversation.
Yeah. Well, so a bunch of different thoughts. So first of all, kind of, I was mentioning before that one of the interesting things about Bretton Woods, when kind of a bunch of men got together basically and decided how our economy is going to work for till this day, really. What was interesting was that there were a couple of idealists around there, and John Maynard Keynes was one of them, and he had very strong feelings about how do we decide what the world reserve currency will be. Now, the world reserve currency today is the dollar. And they wanted it to be, I think they wanted to call it the orb. And one of the things that was interesting, that there was a bureaucrat that was in part of the conversation. I forgot his name. There's a great podcast, and I'll probably send you the link later. And every place where they were talking about what the reserve currency would be, this person made sure that the placeholder will just be the dollar. Just make sure to write the dollar is just a placeholder and so on. By the end of the conference, John Maynard Keynes was a bit ill and tired and didn't read all the fine print. And so by the time that they signed it, the dollar just stayed there. So in a lot of ways, the dollar is quite arbitrarily, or maybe manufactured in a certain way, but the reserve currency of the world. And that kind of just brings me to the idea that this is, in a lot of ways, it's a little bit arbitrary, and B, completely dependent on our belief in it. And by the way, talking about crypto crashing and all that, also this idea of inflation. One of the interesting things about inflation is inflation happens when people think that inflation is happening, right? So kind of how these things mix up with our belief systems, right? And really the dollar isn't pegged to gold, so it's really how much we value it, and that whole conversation is it's a conversation that is either had like at the top echelons of economics, like when people really understand economics, they understand that it's all kind of a conversation, right? It's not a hard science in that sense. And also people who are at the very beginning of it, right? And I kind of see myself as a person not at the very top, but at the very bottom, of kind of like, well, if it's all basically at its core empty and meaningless until we put value into it, then doesn't that mean that we could just do whatever we want? Doesn't that mean that if we can convince enough people that this shitcoin actually is worth something, people will believe that, and it will actually be useful in some sort of way? So that, by the way, goes to the conversation of kind of, how do we value things? And one of the things that I think about that is that if it's useful, right? If it's useful in some sort of way, so we can use the dollar, right? Because everybody agrees that if I give you so-and-so dollars, I'll get so-and-so back. I think that the conversation, and this is kind of, I'm just thinking about this out loud, and regarding martial arts, for instance, because the analogy that you brought before, right? If I could make up a martial art, right, or jiu-jitsu or whatever, and I could give myself a black belt, but when I enter the ring, I will probably not win, because there's nothing behind whatever I just made up. But if I will actually have invented the best martial art of them all, and kind of figure out how to win all fights really easily or whatever, then it shouldn't matter that that martial art didn't always exist and doesn't have a rich history or belief in it. But proof is in the pudding, right? Like here, this person entered the ring and won, right? And so if we're seeing the applications of different coins coming to being and actually being worthwhile, and this is a process that I think that is slow, but it is definitely happening, then I think that that's what's probably going to happen in the end, right? So we have forms of economics that have been around for a very long time. They've also proved their mettle, but now there's kind of new ones entering the ring, and some of them are terrible, right? Some of them are Ponzi schemes, some of them are scams, some of them are pictures of apes. But at the end of the day, there's like an underlying technology there that, when applied correctly, creates real world value, right? It makes life easier. It makes life more, or it makes businesses more transparent, or more accountable, or more useful, or more efficient in different ways. And I think that that should be, at the end of the day, what will convince us, right? Like when we see that happening, and I don't mean like in the future, when we see that happening now, I see that in some projects that are in the refi space, for sure. And I see that in projects that are some of them are just corporate kind of things that are helping organizations to be more efficient. And these are different applications of blockchain that I think at the end of the day will be what proves it to be worthwhile. I like to kind of, this is a little cheesy, but I like it, that the can opener was invented about 40 years after the can was patented. And the can was even invented before that. So for about 40 years at least, there were people who had cans, preservative cans, and they were smashing rocks against them or using knives to kind of pry them open. And realistically, kind of the can opener really made it super effective and really easy to use this wonderful underlying technology. So I think that way about blockchain a lot of the time. So yeah, blockchain was, you could think of it as from the Bitcoin white paper, and then Ethereum coming into programmable money. And we're doing all sorts of funny stuff with it. We're smashing rocks against it, and I don't know, like moving money from one place to another, and it's kind of self-congratulatory. But at the end of the day, there are some applications that are that can opener that are using this in a very good way that I think are going to be world changing. So I kind of went off on a tangent, but I hope that all kind of made sense.
Yeah, no, there are a few threads there I want to pick up on. So you talked about this idea of creating a new martial art, and then you step in the ring and get destroyed. Well, but if you don't, okay, then you did come up with something novel and worthwhile. And that's actually the story of jiu-jitsu. Most martial arts are thousands of years old, and there are always people kind of creating their own styles, and coming up with their own names, and they're quite often they're shysters who are just creating nonsense. But the Gracie family, there's different theories on who actually created Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or the roots of it. But in the 1920s, this new style was developed, and then was kind of this hidden secret in Brazil that, for about 80 years was relatively undefeated in thousands and thousands of fights. And there was this real evolution, this real revolution, a new development, an innovation in this field that no one knew about. And the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which most people know as the UFC, the kind of testing ground of different martial arts, was created by the Gracie family to showcase this art. And I think that analogy actually carries weight, that yeah, you can just create your own coin, your own tokenomics model, that the value if we can get past that initial conversation around understanding that value actually is just speculative, and if enough people do buy into something, then it has value by virtue of their belief in it, then the value of the tokenomics model will be kind of proven by the ring, so to speak, the market of ideas. Does this actually do something novel and valuable in the world? And we are seeing those new innovations being tested, and many of them falling by the wayside, but some really brilliant breakthroughs being proven to have value. And then there's the question of, okay, there's really two questions. How do we get this economics black belt, this professor you were talking about, to understand and then be able to apply his deep insight into the traditional economics thinking? How do we get him to apply that to the Web3 world? And then there's the question of how do we get the average person to understand? And so if we use martial arts as the analogy in both cases, okay, so you've got this kickboxer who's incredible but has no understanding that jiu-jitsu is even a thing. Like, where would you start? It's not show them an armbar or a takedown. You need them to have the paradigm. You need them to have the grounding to understand, how does this thing work? So for those unfamiliar with martial arts or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's designed for a smaller person overcoming a bigger person. And it has a 3-step formula for how do you do that. Most martial arts would say, try to be faster than them and punch and kick. But by the time they're big enough, by the time you can get close enough to even make contact, they can for sure make contact with you. And it might take one punch of theirs to end your night and 10 of yours to make a dent. And so that's not really a wise strategy outside of like fighting someone in your weight class. So the strategy is 3 phases. 1, you get so close to them that they don't have the same knockout power they have at arm's length. Step 2, you find a way to take them to the ground. And then step 3, you get into what we call the mount position, where you're sitting on top of them. The details are, because from there, even a smaller person can relatively easily overcome a bigger person. The details actually don't matter. The point is that there's a framework. There's a context that, should the person understand, should we be able to take this karate black belt or kung fu black belt and help them understand how the art works, then we can start teaching them specific techniques, but they need that kind of universal grounding in the paradigm that allows this new innovation to work at all. And so with, say, the economics professor, rather than us trying to get into the details of forking and DAOs and all the infinite possibilities that are created by Web3, it's more, okay, what is the difference between a centralized system and the blockchain? What does that open up? Understand that, and maybe even prior to that, understand that, yeah, in a classic economics model, value is actually really just a popularity contest, even in the post-Bretton Woods world, even in the global economy. And so if we can take that understanding and then create our own mini economies, then we can apply these new possibilities that the Web3, which is shorthand for the world of possibilities that the blockchain opens up, that we can apply those in tons of different ways. And that's probably a very guaranteed. It's a kind of very rough and poor explanation of the Web3 world. But the idea being, what we need to give them is the big picture understanding, so that they can then they need that grounding so that they can look at the particulars of why one tokenomics model versus another might have value. Then they can bring in their understanding, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I also think that so just to kind of take what you were saying, so there's conceptual understanding, which is, by the way, what's exciting, I think, for most people, right? Like this idea of decentralization, transparency, the big kind of things that are cool about this technology. There's this black box of technology that we don't necessarily have to know how to code to understand what it enables, kind of like the internet, which is the casual kind of analogy. And then there's kind of a set of possibilities that I think that this is, by the way, where I think that the miscommunication comes in, right? Because, okay, you've now created this black box of technology that, you put stuff in and they come out more transparent, or they allow all sorts of things that have certain efficiencies and so on. That's great. Then there are things that are kind of witchcrafty, right? Like that they're economic magic that we are allowing to happen, that have equivalents in the economic world that we currently live in, but we just don't necessarily talk about them. So, a government printing money, is kind of economic magic, right? They're literally printing money out of thin air. And then quantitative easing, right? These things that banks do, right? Is kind of, that's like, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Debt, like these are concepts that we allow to happen in the economic game that we play in our world. And we allow them to happen because we say, well, we trust these institutions that do these things, right? We trust the US government when it prints money, that this money is worth something. We trust the bank that when it's doing lending money out, right? Even though it doesn't actually have that money, right? It's not in their treasury. It's fine because we trust the banks, right? And so in our economic world, we have these institutions that do that stuff, and then we look at them and we say, that's fine, they can do that magic stuff. That's allowed for them. But if an algorithm does this trustlessly, then that's not cool, right? Or we just don't have yet the kind of capacity or trust in this system that we can say, yeah, that's fine, it's okay. So I've been kind of boggled by augmented bonding curves. It's a whole thing, right? So I've been kind of rereading the same text for about a week, because it's kind of like, wait, how does this work? So the concept's pretty simple, right? You don't need a market maker in order to basically get tokens for something, but rather you have a protocol that I'm not going to actually explain this. This is a bad idea. But essentially, the premise is that you are minting tokens according to a certain curve, and the price goes up according to that curve, as opposed to according to supply and demand in this case. And that's like a thing that's not allowed in our economy, really. That doesn't exist. Maybe it does exist, and I just don't know about it. But I don't know about anything that works that way. But it can only work in an environment that says code is law. This is the code. And the thing that the code is creating, which is magic internet money, tokens, is worth something. That's the only situation in which that kind of like little niche of tokenomics can work. And that's completely new, as far as I know, right? Maybe it's not new. I'm willing to, to concede that, but the fact that that is so new, right, requires that jump of logic to say we can trust things that aren't institutions, we can trust code, and the things that those code creates has value for whatever reason. So that's a big jump in logic. Sorry, yeah.
No, I think what's important is, okay, so with these bonding curves, you're pointing to a new innovation that, and perhaps we don't have the grounding in traditional economics, say, oh, this has actually been possible before. But let's say, for argument's sake, okay, so here's this new innovation that's made possible by the kind of magic of Web3. But what you said prior to that is there's the conceptual understanding, but then there's practical understanding. And I think the point is that, you know, when we were originally talking about this, we were saying there was an issue of translation, that we needed to translate the Web3 stuff into Web2 kind of traditional economics language, but it wasn't exactly the right analogy of translation. That is, it's that we need to onboard, we need to get someone to have that conceptual understanding. But what you're pointing out now is that's not enough. Once they have that conceptual understanding, once they understand, okay, what's the concept, if we use the jiu-jitsu analogy, how does jiu-jitsu work, then they actually have to go spend some time doing the moves so they can see and get familiar and get their own grounding in, or their tactile understanding of the ins and outs of how things work, to look at, once they have the conceptual understanding, to look at specific examples of tokenomics models that have worked, that have flopped. And then once they have that familiarity, then there's a chance for them to really grasp these truly new innovative models, like the ones you're pointing to. And I think that what we're seeing in all this is kind of the workflow of onboarding, that it has to start with the big picture conceptual that can allow it to tether, or at least be a baby step from where they're starting. Then they have to like spend some time with examples to really give deeper context and deeper understanding and meaning to that conceptual understanding. Then we can speak to innovation. Then we can speak to augmented bonding curves and new approaches, impact measurement, and all the fun things we're working on. So, and this is really how you would take someone who's an expert in another martial art and teach them jiu-jitsu. You know, and in a lot of instances, people are just kind of thrown to the wolves and not given that conceptual understanding. But without that, they struggle for years until it just eventually clicks. Whereas, you know, you can really accelerate someone's learning curve by first giving them that conceptual understanding, then putting them in situations so they kind of understand it in an embodied sense. They really grasp it, and then they can apply their previous understanding and merge that with their new knowledge, and even in time, and this happens all the time in jiu-jitsu at least, actually come up with their own techniques and strategies. And so I think there is, and part of the reason we started recording this was not because we had like a discrete ABC, but more because we wanted to explore this. We saw that there's something here, and that this would give us now not only something of value to share, but then also the raw materials to, say, write an article that more discreetly articulates all these concepts.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm sorry, I keep on like throwing tangents because I have to. This is the way I talk.
Keep them coming.
So it's really interesting. Thomas Kuhn talks about paradigm shifts, right? So he talks about scientific paradigm shifts and how they work, and basically it's a cycle, right? So he doesn't describe scientific discovery as kind of a linear model, but rather a cycle that kind of recurs. And you know, what usually happens is that there's a a paradigm, right? There's kind of understanding of how science works, right? And then we go into a time of normal science. So what that would look like is Aristotle says Earth is the center of the universe, and this is how the planets go around the Earth. And then there's all sorts of riddles that we kind of have to figure out around that assumption. So it creates an assumption that this is the basis of our science from now on, and this is how things work. And then other scientists come along, and what they do in the time of normal science is they basically elaborate on that paradigm, right? So later on, Ptolemy comes around and says, oh, well, the reason that we see planets going this way and that way is because they're actually going around in loops and so on. It's a fun model. If you ever look at Ptolemy's version of the universe, you would look at it, and it's, first of all, it's very elegant, and it makes perfect sense. Yeah, if you did not have a telescope, then you would not be able to disprove it, really. It'd be very, very difficult for you to mathematically, geometrically, whatever, it works, right? And then what starts to happen is there's a new innovation in science. There's something happens that changes the telescope in this case. And once that telescope came and they said, oh, well, it seems that actually these are not exactly what we thought, and we're seeing things that shouldn't work with this paradigm that we understand. And then what starts to happen is that other people kind of throw out their ideas of why this isn't working. And then basically science goes into crisis. So we went from paradigm establishment to normal science, and then it goes into crisis. And then in that crisis, there's all sorts of like competing versions of what the new paradigm will be. One of them emerges as successful because it has new tools to work with. And it explains our reality in a better way than we understood it before. So it's just better tools to describe reality. And I think that something similar is happening in economics, and particularly in capitalism, which is basically economics for all intents and purposes, where for a while now, we've kind of noticed that capitalism isn't perfect, right? We're kind of like, oh, well, you know what? We need conscious capitalism, right? We need a citizen capitalism. We need accountable. I don't know. There's a billion different types of like people. I'm not even talking about people saying like we need socialism or anything. We're just talking about people who agree that capitalism is okay, but we just need to fix it a little bit. And that's, by the way, where impact comes in as well, and impact measurement. These are all like corporate social responsibility is a patch for the things that capitalism doesn't do well, right? So we're saying like, yes, we know there are externalities, but we can't do them. So let's just create another report that explains why our company is great. So I think that that's kind of what's happening with blockchain in a lot of ways. It's definitely the new paradigm in my view. And we have different competing versions of kind of like, well, how are we going to apply this new technology? How are we going to make this kind of work? And the problem, or maybe the challenge of this era, is that we're moving so fast that we have people who are already developing like whole new economic systems at a very advanced and fast pace, when like the paradigm hasn't really shifted for most people. Yeah, and usually what will happen when a scientific paradigm shifts is that somebody's going to write a textbook, and that textbook becomes the predominant textbook, and then everybody learns that, and they're like, this is how the universe works. And there'll be people that'll like hold on to the belief of the previous system, but they literally die out. They kind of, they're just irrelevant at some point. And so you can imagine that takes decades, which is the truth. And here we're moving like really fast. There's also kind of like this need for capitalism to fix itself or evolve. And there's also this need for us to kind of like evolve the way that we do business, because it's actually affecting our planet and our societies and our lives. And so I think that that's kind of also creating that onboarding crisis that we're actually talking about. This is why it kind of burns for us, and we're like, no, these people have to understand, because we need them on the bus. Like we can't kind of just have some people doing this and some people doing that. Maybe the innovation will work. Like it's this kind of paradigm shift that also has an urgency to it, which I don't think is usual. Maybe it is, but I don't think it is. That's interesting.
And there are, and this brings up a few things. So if we just look at the paradigm shifts, like we saw this actually in the martial arts world, where, so many modern martial artists grew up on Bruce Lee movies and all that. And so the paradigm was that you need to be fast, you need to use these secret techniques. It was about punching and kicking. And then you were mentioning seeing the first Ultimate Fighting Championship, the first UFC, where Royce Gracie, this tall, skinny guy, went in lightest of all the guys competing and beat 3 people in one night. And it was a paradigm shift. It was all of a sudden, holy cow, what we thought was the most effective thing. And it was really billed as, a test of is karate better than kung fu? Is that better than Muay Thai? Is that better than boxing or sumo? And so put all these different arts in, and it turned out, oh wow, jiu-jitsu is. And then that kind of revolutionized martial arts. And for a long time, people thought nothing could beat jiu-jitsu. And then all of a sudden you had a wrestler go in and learn enough jiu-jitsu to slow down the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, and then seemed like that was the thing. And then you had a kickboxer, a Muay Thai fighter, who learned just enough wrestling to not get taken to the ground. And there were these paradigm shifts that emerged in martial arts. And what happened over time was the synthesis where really today you can't survive in that arena unless you have a grounding in what is in the arts that have proven themselves to be most effective: some form of jiu-jitsu, some form of wrestling, and some form of kickboxing. And so this synthesis has emerged, and this real paradigm shift has emerged through real world testing, and that actual testing in the real world versus just staying in the conceptual, which so many martial arts did for really centuries, because there was no arena in which to test them. That having a proven ground was really vital. And then the other piece, as you talk about, onboarding the world and kind of people becoming experts. I was having a conversation. I don't know if you know Jeff Emmett. He's what I would consider a black belt in tokenomics. And he works with block science and a number of these kind of cutting edge orgs. I think Giveth, and he's like a black belt's black belt. He's on the cutting edge of this stuff. And those are not necessarily the people that you want teaching a first day white belt, because they're so deep into things that they don't necessarily understand. Like, they'll be talking about a high level concept as though it's something people have a grounding in. And what you need is, that's where translation becomes important. That's where onboarding and being able to simplify those big concepts into something that the average person can get. And there are people who are, maybe high level martial artists, but they're experts in getting beginners to understand these things. And the question really is, how do we, and this is something we've kind of discussed, that the Web3 world as a whole needs to find a way to bring in the average person. If this is really going to get mass adoption, we have to find simple language to explain it to the uninitiated. And it might be something like this. It might be using analogies that are maybe a little more on the ground, so to speak, that are a little more accessible than something as, because to even assume, so there's two kind of markets, or two groups of folks. How do we onboard the professors of economics, which is a very specialized group who have a grounding, and we can use analogies that we know they know. But then how do we get the people who've never studied economics whatsoever to understand things, and then still be able to participate and understand, so that we really do leverage the trustless, decentralized nature that allows everyone to participate.
Yeah, great professors aren't always good teachers. If you've ever been to university, kind of notice that, that some people who are fantastic researchers are just not good communicators, and that's okay. Really, you don't have to know everything to be able to teach it to the next person. And if there's ever been a place that's been evident, is the Web3 world. Like, if people are learning from each other live, people are learning in public. It's actually pretty cool and inspiring. And I think that you're right. This is the kind of conversation. And I don't have much more to add to that, but I do want to reference kind of something that you were saying about martial arts, which I saw randomly somewhere on social media, that there was a boxer way back when called Daniel Mendoza, who was he was kind of the guy who in the UK invented like dodging and like defending, and not like just bare knuckle boxing the hell out of each other. And he won fights. He won lots of fights, and he was like the champion. And people like in the beginning ridiculed him as a coward. They were like, "Oh, you're defending, you're dodging, like, you know, that's cowardice." And you know, okay, so you know, when there's something new, you might misinterpret it, and you might like look at NFTs and say, I don't need a pixelated picture of a punk, right? Like, what do I do with this? But then you don't understand that you could literally save the Amazon by buying some of that. So yeah, so I think that I just kind of maybe toward summarizing, one of my main takeaways from this conversation is that the conversation is important, and the analogies are important, and it's also important to kind of match the people teaching to each other, right? It's not that the professor needs to teach the white belt, and it's not that, yeah, I'll stop there because I wonder how you kind of see it.
Yeah, I think we're speaking the same language where everyone has their role. But just one thing I want to speak to, you talked about how there's learning in public and the Web3 is this very organic thing that's happening. It's true, but it's also very much a walled garden. I found like that before being able to, and I don't even know that I could describe how I started kind of breaking through some of these barriers, but I didn't understand what Web3 is till maybe 6 months ago. And I still don't know that I could fully explain it. And you know, it's like once you're in, then there's all sorts of ways people are very free with their time and information and will help you out. But it's that there's a big divide between those who know nothing about it, and where I think Web3 uniquely has an opportunity and capability to solve for that is tokenomics and reward. That we can incentivize and reward people for becoming the onboarders, where we can actually, you know, some folks watching may know Elliott, who did a great Twitter thread explaining what refi is, and we were in our previous conversation saying, you know, I want to retweet that as, this is a public good. Like, explaining this in layman's terms is a really important thing, because otherwise it's this exclusive club, and that's against the whole spirit of Web3. The whole regen spirit of Web3 is that, you know, it's everyone for everyone. That's obviously the intent behind global unity. And yet, if we don't solve for making it accessible, then we're just, you know, patting ourselves on the back while we're you know, really another privileged elite group. And so I think the fact that Web3 has the superpower of being able to reward anything and track and reward any activity means that we can, you know, create little contests for who can explain Web3 the best, and then reward people for doing so, and then reward people for taking, you know, hand holding someone through the onboarding process. And, you know, as you would, you know, I own a martial arts school, and so, you know, there isn't a, you know, a financial reward, but it's greatly appreciated when a senior person spends time to explain something to someone. I've created my own video courses on just the beginner concepts specifically for that purpose, because the beginning of any activity, martial arts is an easy example, is intimidating, and it's confusing, and it's bewildering. And so, and that's no less true by any means for Web3. And if we can make it easy to get started, if we can make it palatable, if we can make it step by step and make it clear what those steps are, we really do good for those looking to get into that world, and even those who don't even realize that there's a world worth diving into.
Yeah, Absolutely. And while you were talking, there's a bunch of examples that come to mind. By the way, but for me, and I'm not like super tech savvy, but I'm tech savvy enough. Like I had to get my mind to understand how Discord works. That was like, and I'm new to Twitter, and like all this different stuff is completely new to me, and that seems to be where all this is happening. And then to understand why you need Medium articles as opposed to Mirror, as opposed to, there's like a whole lexicon of things that you need to work on, and the where you can access them to learn how to do it is on Twitter and Discord, funny enough. So there's plenty of really good educators on Twitter, Elliott among them, and Carl Cervone, I'm not sure I'm saying his last name right, but he like has like a 14-day immersive kind of experience that you'll just read this stuff and do this, and you'll understand a lot of it. So there's really good stuff out there, and we should probably link to it. But yeah, but then there's that first step that's super difficult, right? And really kind of have to meet people where they are a lot of the times. And maybe that's kind of the little bridge that we need to build so they can even reach the really good educators that have really great ways of explaining really great things.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is we're not really talking publicly about global unity for a little while. You've gotten to hear the vision and the plan, but this is an integral part of it. This kind of tiered onboarding, where it has to be really easy to get started. And so there are some really brilliant Web3 projects, regenerative Web3 projects that have inspiring innovations, but in some cases their documentation are 100 pages long. Who's going to read that? It has to be bite-sized and tiered. It has to be this staged process. There's someone in you mentioned people who are good at onboarding. Jared Lucas has a lot of great resources on Web3 as well, and he created the Liminal DAO. And someone in that group pointed to this article called Skim Grok Master, the idea that you have to have communication in different types of forms. So for example, for global unity, it's such a big idea that who's going to read our 60-page white paper? We have a 1-sentence version, and a 1-page version, and a 2-page version, a 15-page version, then the white paper. We have videos on it. And this is really important, that there has to be bite size, especially we have to meet people where they are. We have to have the Instagram and TikTok versions that are 30 seconds long, that are at the kind of top of the funnel to get them, if they're interested in learning next level, we make that available. And so I think there's a real opportunity, and I'm glad we had this conversation, not only because I think there's some great framings around analogies from martial arts that might be useful, but I think we've also underscored the importance of making this stuff accessible to the average person, which if we are really going to get Web3, which those in that world know can really make a big difference. If we are going to get it out, it has to be something that we make accessible to the average person.
100%. That's yeah, I'm inspired. This is the feeling I'm feeling.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the time. I'm glad we did this. And if you're watching and have any comments, just put them below or tweet this out. And maybe we'll hold a Twitter space on it. But yeah, and if you have resources that we don't know about, please link to them as well, because we're all learning together. WAGMI, right? We're all going to make it only together.
We're all going to learn together. No, what was that? WAG.
WAG.
Right.
We'll save it.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Elliott.
Okay. Thanks, Or.
Take care.